Hello, friends. All right, thank you all for coming today. So what we're going to do starting this year is during this time, so we'll have adoration confession until 7, and then there will be a formation talk from 7 to 7:15, 7:20, and then student mass will start at 7:30. So the idea of this talk is for us to be able to learn more about our faith and more of like the intellectual side of Catholicism. Why do we believe what we believe? And we'll have a talk ready for you all every single week to engage in that. So today we are going to kick off by talking a little bit about science and religion. Now, this is a topic that is very dear to my heart. So I graduated with a degree in chemical engineering, and we hear it often today that science and religion, science and Catholicism, science and Christianity are opposed to one another, or they're in conflict, that you can't be both a religious person and a scientific person. And I want to talk a little bit about this. So when I was a senior graduating, we had a big end-of-the-year social for everyone in my engineering class. And at this point, when I graduated from here, I went to seminary right after that. So everyone knew that I was kind of like the religious guy. So this conversation came up often. And I remember specifically talking with a group of friends in my class. And one guy said this to me, and this is the exact quote. He said, "You know, I was raised Catholic, but then I found science." And I just kind of gave him a strange look, and I was like, let's talk about that. So that's kind of what I want to talk about today. So one of the main points that I want to make is this supposed conflict is, to say it nicely, complete garbage. And you can actually look at the main thinkers, atheistic thinkers, the past 300 years, and you can see that their main tactic has been to set up a contradiction between religion and science. But we know today, and the point I want to argue is that it is Christianity is responsible for science as we know it. So when we say science, what is it that we mean? Now, normally when we say science, we think of technology or a series of discoveries, but that's actually not what we mean by science. What we mean is that science is more of a mentality than anything else. So we have the scientific method. So what do you do in the scientific method? You observe nature, then you come up with some sort of hypothesis. And then with that hypothesis, you go and you conduct an experiment. And based on that experiment, you either come up with a conclusion or you rework your hypothesis and do another experiment. So that is what we mean by science. That is the scientific method. Science is not just technology. It's not just a series of discoveries. It is more so than anything else a mentality. And what we know is that it was Christian theology that was needed to develop science. That is the main point I want to argue for today. Science needed Christian theology in order to develop. So 2,000 years ago, when Jesus Christ walked on this earth, when Christianity came on the scene, there were 5 countries that were much further ahead societally, culturally, technologically than Europe was at that time, or than the Middle East was at that time, or at least where Israel was. So China, Egypt, India, Babylon, and the Arab Empire. And much research has been done that these 5 places during the time of Christianity, when Christianity came on the scene, were much further ahead than Christian Europe was at the time, and should have been the ones that had developed science. But that is not what happened. So all of them had alchemy. But it was only in Christian Europe that alchemy turned into chemistry. All of those places had astrology, but it was only in Christian Europe that astrology turned into astronomy. And now, what will be said is the argument has been made before that Christianity, that the Catholic Church invented science. And what most people will say to counter that idea is, well, of course it was Catholics that developed science. During that time, everyone was Catholic. Now, the problem with that is none of these other 5 places around the world developed science. It only developed in a specific place in the world and with a specific culture. Plus, it assumes that everyone during that time just was completely Catholic and believed everything, which we know today that is not true. So, Christian theology was essential for the rise of science. So in ancient Greek and ancient Rome, they had classical learning academies. And we can look back at them and see that we know that science did not develop in them because they were way over theoretical and over practical. So they didn't care about the daily occurrences of life where Christianity did. It was only in Christian universities that science developed. So why is that? I think there are a number of reasons why Christian theology is necessary for science. Reason number one, Christianity depicted God as rational, as responsive, as dependable, and the universe as his personal creation. So what does this mean? If God is rational, and God is dependable, and God is stable, and the universe is God's creation, therefore the universe is rational, and the universe is stable, the universe is dependable. And if the universe and the world is rational, then it is knowable and therefore discoverable. So this is a claim that we take for granted now, but most societies back then did not have a rational God. So if God is rational, if the universe is his creation, then the universe therefore is rational. And since it's rational, it is discoverable. So it is that mentality that would lead you to develop science. We also know that Christians saw rationality as part of God's creation. So by being more rational, we could celebrate who God was. Now, most other cultures at this time were polytheistic. They did not have one God. They had multiple gods, and these gods were impersonal. So they had multiple gods, and the gods were impersonal. Now, what is the root word of culture? Cult. So we know through many studies of history that every society in history has been based on their worship of God, which is why we get culture today from the root word of cult. Whatever you worship as a society, that's what develops your culture. So these cultures with impersonal gods and many gods didn't have the culture set up in which science could develop. It was only in a culture that had a rational, singular God. So God is rational, the world is rational, therefore we can discover more about the world. Christians also believe that the world is good. So since the world is good, it is good to know more about the world. And by knowing more about the world, we can therefore know more about God. Again, this is a subtle point that we take for granted, that back during this time period, many cultures did not see the world as good. Many people saw this conflict between good and evil, and that the spirit was good and creation was evil. If creation is evil, you're not going to want to discover and learn more about it. So Christians believed it was a duty, that they didn't just believe that we could know more about the world, but it was a duty to know more about the world so we can know more about God and we can marvel at God. I think we see this in Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the works of his hands. So there's this idea in Christianity that the world proclaims God's work. Therefore, it is good to know about the world. All right, next point. In pantheism, which was very popular during this time, one of the major beliefs of pantheism is that the world is God. So everything is God. And now maybe people didn't believe everything in the world was God, but they believed trees were God, or they believed that the sun was God. We have many historical evidences of this. Now, the problem is that if you believe the world is God, you can't experiment on the world, because then you would be experimenting on God. And you can't experiment on God. That's the most irreverent thing possible. So Christianity posited that the world is God's creation and therefore not God, so it is okay to experiment on the world. Again, this is another point that we take for granted, but if you look back in time, these were not things that other cultures took for granted. Other religions did not have a creation, and therefore they had some sort of world that had no beginning or had no purpose. So if the world has no beginning or has no purpose, there's no reason to investigate it farther. There's this idea today that we Christians need to be kind of weary of the new scientific advances because, is this going to disprove something in the Bible, or is this going to prove just something about our faith? But this has never been a Christian attitude, because if anything is true, God is truth. And it can only be in accordance with God. So Christians had this scientific mentality because the search into nature could only vindicate the faith, could only strengthen your faith, could only make you believe more about God. So we know that science is the natural outgrowth of Christian doctrine. God is rational. Creation is rational. The world is good. The world is not God. It was these mentalities that came from the Judeo-Christian worldview that were not present in these other 5 countries that were much further ahead of Christianity at the time. That is what allowed science to develop. So I want to end by naming a couple Christian scientists. And the thing is, another reason why we can't just say, it was the Christians or the Catholics that invented science because everyone at that time was Catholic. One, that's not true, and we know that's not true. But it wasn't just your regular people that were your greatest scientists at the time. It was the most Catholic people that were scientists. It was usually the priests and monks, the people who had the greatest stake in Catholicism, that ended up having these scientific discoveries. And even people that we wouldn't expect. There's a famous quote by Albert Einstein where he said, "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind." So I just want to name a couple of these scientists. Louis Pasteur was a lay Catholic. He's known as the father of bacteriology and microbiology. Roger Bacon, he was the person who developed the scientific method. He was a Franciscan friar. Father Giambattista Riccoli was the first person to measure the rate of acceleration of a freely falling body. Father Nicholas Steno, a Catholic priest, is known as the father of geology. Father Roger Boscovich is known as the father of modern atomic theory. There's a period of time when the study of earthquakes was so dominated by Jesuits that they actually called it the Jesuit science. Nicholas Copernicus, we've all heard of him. He's better known as Father Nicholas Copernicus. He was the first to show the earth revolved around the moon. Now, many people like to bring up the Galileo affair, and I just want to encourage you all to look into and do your research on the Galileo affair. I think it's something that we don't need to be ashamed of as Catholics. Were some mistakes made at the time? Yes. But there's a famous quote by Alfred North Whitehead, who's a well-known scientist and philosopher, and he noted that during this time in New England, there were lots of persecutions and tortures done by witches in the U.S. by Protestants, and he said the worst thing that happened to men of science was that Galileo suffered an honorable detention and a mild reproof. So that's a whole nother talk, but I just want to encourage you all to look into that, to be prepared when that gets brought up. Father Gregor Mendel is the father of modern genetics. The Big Bang Theory was developed by Father George Lemaitre. He was a Belgian priest and physicist. Robert Boyle was an Anglican who's known as the first modern chemist. Islam, both Islam and both classical Greece and Rome, the classical period, didn't allow dissections on the human body. If you died when you were alive or when you died. So it was Christian scholars that developed the field of physiology because they found it fine in order to do dissections on the body. So we know about our bodies because of Christianity today, because Christianity incorporated a mindset in which it was okay to do dissections on the human body. So what I want to encourage you all to do is do a Google search and look up 2 things. Go to Wikipedia and look up 1, the list of Catholic clergy scientists, and 2, the list of Catholic lay scientists. You don't need to do all these things that I noticed are just a little bit of all of these scientists over time. And it's not hard to do the research. It's right there on Wikipedia. Now, what has happened is study after study shows that physical scientists, so scientists in biology, chemistry, and physics, have an extremely high belief in God. What happens is the social scientists are the ones who have a low belief in God. Now, when you go into school and you read a textbook, whether it's scientific or not, they're usually written by social scientists and not physical scientists. So it can come across that there is some sort of conflict among religion and science in many of our books, but they're actually usually not written by scientists. By physical scientists, are usually written by social scientists. So what I want to leave you with today is don't believe the silly and ridiculous lie that science and religion or science and Catholicism are opposed to one another. And what I would argue that this is the Catholic belief. So in the Annunciation, the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary, and what did Mary say? "Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord, be it done unto me according to your word." So that word handmaid, she's an instrument that God uses to glorify God. Now, the Catholic belief has always been is that science is the handmaid of theology. You can look over time and you see this over and over again. Science is the handmaid of theology. So science is an instrument that theology uses to better understand and glorify God. And that's what I would argue is the Catholic position. There is no conflict. And even if we know that, we can subtly have fear of someone bringing up this idea of this conflict, but we shouldn't. We should be bold and strong and firm in believing that there's no conflict, that indeed it was Christian theology that was needed to develop science. So that will conclude today. We will have about 10 minutes to pray before Mass. And the goal is to get these talks out earlier in the week so you all can know if you all want to come to a specific talk, if you want to invite a friend and be like, oh, I know this person that would like this topic, we will try to get that out earlier. So we can take these next couple minutes and pray before Mass.